You may recall the Trudeau-led Liberal government passed a law that required provinces and territories to implement a carbon tax by January 1st, 2019. If they didn't adopt anything, they would face one imposed by the federal government. All of this was done to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, which called for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. 3 provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, took issue with this mandated carbon tax and took the case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, in late March 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada issued its long-awaited ruling on the constitutionality of the carbon tax. They ruled the carbon tax is constitutional. So what now for Canadians who believe that climate change is real but are concerned with the financial burden we are placing on ourselves with a carbon tax? How will this imposition of a tax impact our oil and gas industry? And will any of this effort actually have an impact on reducing global carbon emissions? Well, joining us today to discuss this decision is Peter McCaffrey, president of the Alberta Institute, and Dr. Dwight Newman, professor of law at the University of Saskatchewan and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me today. I'm looking forward to this discussion on what happened with the Supreme Court of Canada just a few weeks ago. So I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Newman. Could you just give us a rundown or bring us up to speed as to what events transpired to get us to the place where this court case, the challenge was placed in front of the Supreme Court of Canada?
Well, it started out with Saskatchewan launching to its Court of Appeal what's called a reference question, where a province can ask its Court of Appeal to rule on a legal question. And through that, the province could challenge the carbon tax. So Saskatchewan started that out initially. Later on, Ontario and Alberta both launched similar kinds of reference cases. And the carbon tax was upheld by both the Saskatchewan and Ontario courts, but by divided courts. But the Alberta Court of Appeal would have struck it down, also by a divided court. So from a policy that started out with a lot of people thinking that it was just going to be upheld straightforwardly, there were serious legal questions there, and it was taken by way of appeals on up to the Supreme Court of Canada for the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on the case. Okay, and as we mentioned in March, they were in a divided court, though. They ruled, though, in favor of the constitutionality and that the government can proceed with this. Peter McCaffrey, were you surprised with this decision?
I wouldn't say that I was surprised overall. I think that a lot of people in Alberta were thinking that this is the way that the case was going to go. If anything, perhaps getting 3 justices dissenting was a surprise rather than 1 or 2. I feel like, though it might not feel like it yet, and maybe most Canadians haven't really noticed yet, that the Supreme Court's decision on this carbon tax has probably set in motion a series of events that will have a pretty significant impact on our country. And I think part of the reason for that is because actually the case isn't just about the carbon tax. It's about jurisdictional issues between the federal and provincial governments. And obviously that's something that's really impacting Alberta at the moment.
Yes, most definitely. And I think you're right. This will have long-term ramifications for things down the road. And we'll get into that perhaps later in the show. So I found one thing that was interesting in the Supreme Court decision. It said that this is not a tax, it's carbon pricing. And I found that kind of strange. Is this just the court playing semantics? Peter, what are your thoughts?
I mean, yes and no. One of the concerns that a lot of people have had about the Supreme Court of Canada is that really the court is more of a political body, and this isn't some recent claim. This goes right back to Confederation, where actually there wasn't even really a Supreme Court to begin with, and the concern is that the Supreme Court was looking for ways to justify allowing the federal government to impose these sorts of policies onto the provinces. Canada, unlike many other federal systems, is not meant to be a system where the federal government rules over the provinces. Right. The federal government and the provinces are meant to be equal and partners in Confederation. And the Constitution sets out clear jurisdictions where the federal government has its job to do and the provinces have their job to do. And really Alberta's concern, and the concerns of other provinces that joined in on this case as well, there were 6 provinces opposed to this case, was that this this ruling and this carbon tax sets a precedent that will allow the federal government to intervene in all sorts of other areas of provincial jurisdiction. And the court tried to prevent that by, trying to claim that this was a very narrowly scoped decision that only affects this one very narrow issue. But, realistically, that's just not how court cases work.